Day 1 summary, and Day 2 introduction. Day 2 of the workshop began with a brief summary of Day 1, followed by an introduction to Day 2 panels and the R&D agenda development process. Welcome, everybody, to the Day 2 of the workshop. The Day 2 brings together disability and accessibility experts, consumers, assistive technology vendors, mainstream researchers, all of whom are together to try to identify and explore the barriers that the new interface technologies might present. We not only want to look at barriers, these new technologies are going to allow us to explore new solutions for a lot of the problems we've had before. So that's going to be exciting as well. They're going to try to look at each of the different technologies we talked about yesterday, as well as things that came up in the discussions yesterday, and try to look at them within the context of each of the panels today. Remember that the goal of this whole session today is going to be to try and create the kickoff agenda. To kick off the development of the R&D agenda for this area, to try to address how to make the next generation technologies accessible as they come out. So I'm going to hand the mic off to Vint now, and he's going to give a quick update of the kind of everything that happened yesterday as a lead-in for those of you who might have had to miss some or another of the panels. And then we will talk about the plan for today and get going. Vint?
Well, thanks so much, Greg. And welcome, everyone. I'm not tired. Day is worth discussion in 10 minutes. That would be impossible. But I'm going to just hit some highlights of notes that I took during the course of the day. In the first session with Bran Farren and Jerry Ellsworth, we talked about visions of the future. And Bran said something very interesting about interfaces. He said that there are only three kinds. There are intuitive interfaces, like you push the door to make it open, or non-intuitive interfaces, like how to fly a helicopter, and then bad interfaces. And that's probably the largest category as we think our way through all this. Many of them he characterized as using parlor tricks in order to keep your attention, but didn't necessarily produce the result you were looking for. Ted Sulker, who led that discussion, drew our attention to fidelity and competence in terms of the way the interfaces work and whether or not they produce the result that you're looking for. Bran made the point that that the software, the interface that produces the software, works best if it has some idea of what it is that you're trying to do. So the idea that goals are understood in the course of composing the interface is very important. Later on in the day, we observed that it might be necessary to build different interfaces depending on what tasks or goals are to be accomplished, and that we shouldn't be surprised, for example, if we need to construct interfaces that vary depending on the kind of disability that we're trying to accommodate. Bran made the comment that the one thing that we can't overcome in any of our efforts is human dumbass behavior, which I took to be a technical term. And finally, again, not successfully summarizing everything here, but standards turned out to be a very important notion. Uniformity, or at least some sort of similarity among the various interfaces and the way in which the controls work seemed to be very important. We went on to talk about natural language interfaces, and of course GPT-3 and Google's Bard and others came up. I think the most important point that was made is that there was fluency in these interfaces where you're interacting with them, but they bordered on the edge of glibness, at least in my interpretation. Ben Schneiderman took the view that natural language interfaces were too slow, and that we needed more direct manipulation in order to be effective in using various interfaces. And there was debate about that. It might very well turn out to be the case that we end up using both of these kinds of interfaces, direct manipulation of some sort, as well as kind of conversation. Another thing that popped up of great importance was the provenance of the data that is used to present the information, or the provenance of the materials used to construct the interactive natural language interfaces. We discovered that a lot of these chatbots will misrepresent things very glibly and very persuasively. And so we we learned the lesson that we have to pay attention to the content that comes up. One thing I observed was that watching people using Google tools, many of them go directly to YouTube and say, "How do I do X?" And they get a video that shows them how to do that. You can imagine that kind of negotiation taking place. Meredith brought up data poisoning as a potential hazard, a way of messing up the use of large-scale language models. So that, I think, still remains a significant problem. We went on to look at extended reality, virtual reality, and augmented reality. Jaron Lanier brought up the idea of spontaneous creation of content, the sort of thing that happens when we're speaking. For example, we use natural language in order to describe what's in our heads, and that turns out to be a very important part of the extended reality and virtual and augmented reality world, because you might see the real world, but you see observations about it from which you can learn. He used a very interesting phrase, mashup AI, which I thought we might want to adopt as a way of understanding how we can use these various technologies in order to combine them. Hiroshi brought up something called the Matterverse, which is a very interesting notion that he wants us to interact with the real world, physical world, not just the virtual world. And so he showed examples of ways in which physical objects could interact with people, or people could interact with them in an immersive kind of way. Andy Wilson asked the question, will people really work in VR with a headset on for many hours a day? And I think that's still an open question. Historically, we've used teleoperation as a way of interacting with the real world, and that might still turn out to be part of what happens. One of the problems that Amitabh brought up is that if we're looking at 3D environments where we're trying to create holographic displays, one of the big challenges is the rate at which you have to produce pixels in order to create a realistic 3D environment. And interestingly enough, he called it the refresh rate challenge, but interestingly enough, he said that there are demonstrations of mechanisms that he called nanophotonic phased arrays, in which they have refresh rates of 100 gigahertz, but you only need 10% of them to be operating in order to create the illusion of a holographic 3D environment. That was a surprise. It made me think of how our brains often fill in the blanks when we're looking at a partial scene, and so we often don't see where the holes are. We talked for a while about haptics, and that, of course, brought back Hiroshi's point about interacting physically with things. Of course, that led to the idea of wearing an entire bodysuit for the day in order to have full haptic as well as virtual visual interfaces. And we talked briefly about smell-o-vision and the idea of generating olfactory input or even taste, neither of which is very well developed at this point. So we didn't anticipate very much along those lines certainly not in the near term. We were talking, of course, looking 20 years ahead. Interestingly enough, Andy Wilson made the point that teachers hated avatars, and I wrote that down and then said why. And they said the reason they don't like them is that they can't tell from an avatar how the student is reacting to the lessons that the teacher is trying to lead them through. And that meant even less connection than one would have with a more face-to-face interaction. Let's see. Okay, let's keep going. We went on to direct brain interfaces, uh, and Hodak said something really interesting. He said that there were actually only 4 million visual sensors in the retina and 33,000 hair cells in the cochlea, which is a really tiny number relative to the billions of neurons that we know are part of the brain. And so his point was that we get massive compression of input information through that through that input medium uh, by factors of 100 or more. Um, and yet all of the things that we perceive are all presented to our brain in exactly the same way. It's a spike train of neural pulses, and the brain interprets those depending on which part of the brain it is that's observing those spikes. Um, Natalia talked about non-invasive interfaces like mobile phones and headsets and things like that. Um, and things like Apple Watch or others that have sensors in them so that they are, although they're non-invasive, they're observing body state. Um, Nicholas was concerned about our ability to regain agency when we're dealing with these kinds of non-invasive interfaces. Mariam brought up some really interesting ideas about direct brain interfaces where we're physically interfacing two neurons in the brain. And that's an invasive kind of technology. Bin He also spoke about these direct interfaces and found them to be quite powerful, even when the signals are relatively weak, like wearing a helmet that's detecting small leak signals coming from the mixture of signals in the brain. And the point that was made is that in spite of the fact that there's a lot of noise, it's possible to extract signal from that for purposes of control. There was an example, for example, of a drone that was being controlled up and down, left and right, simply by thinking and consequently creating patterns. Um, One of the points that was made about direct brain interfaces is that there may be regulatory barriers to actually implementing these things. Um, that will turn out to be a big challenge. We talked for again in another session on machine vision and what is it that computers can see compared to what humans see. And it turns out that humans have a much richer ability to interpret the world that they see than the computers do. But that over time, the computers may discover the things that we do. For example, the cup is not part of the table, but you don't know that until you see it removed from the table, either directly or maybe because you have the ability to manipulate the real world. You can discover that things are not part of a whole, that they're separable, and then you can recognize objects that way. Sorry, I'm going through my notes here slowly and trying to pull out the bits and pieces. Okay. So one of the interesting challenges is having a computer understand what's going on, not just in a fixed image, but in a video image, a scene where things are happening. The question is, what's happening there? What's going on? Can you formulate a model? Can you explain what's going on in that three-dimensional environment? We also noted the importance of predictability, or the utility of being able to make predictions about what's happening so that you can anticipate responses to what's going on. Aude Oliva said that the brain actually mixes together all of the inputs, whether it's visual or sound or haptic or otherwise. All those modalities are needed in order to formulate a model of what's going on in the world. So we should not isolate and pursue our research in silos without realizing that the brain is putting together all of those signals into a more coherent whole. So we should do the same in our research. Let's see. One of the things that Marshall pointed out was that we should also try to know what we don't know. And this is to avoid misunderstanding things. We don't want to leap to conclusions based on a model which is not accurate. And so we should actually understand what it is that we don't know in our software modeling. We went on finally to a roundtable discussion. And there were a lot of questions about personalization and privacy. How much information do we have to have about a person in order to make an interface work? But how do we protect that information if it's considered that it might expose privacy? So that turns out to be a big problem. There was concern about going from Big Brother, which is a privacy concern, to Big Mother, which is a nurturing kind of idea. And I thought that was worth remembering. Let's see, I think in the past it was observed that humans controlled machines, and in the present there's an increased dependency on them, and so it isn't quite clear who's in control. It's sort of like your mobile may be more in charge of your life than you are because of all the apps that we're depending on. It was certainly thought that AI is seen as unreliable today, but 20 years from now, it may be that AI can filter bad content out and do a better job of detecting and rejecting bad behaviors. A lot of concern was that the AI systems are statistical in nature, and it may very well be that they therefore aim for the average case. And that's exactly the wrong case to accommodate when we're dealing with people who have extreme problems with vision or hearing or sense or motor control. So we should be very careful about mistakenly thinking that AI will solve the problem if it will only really work well for the average rather than the extreme cases. And finally, there was a lot of discussion about personalization in general. You know, smart limbs that that understand tasks and understand you and how you work. There's a lot of interest in working in a collaborative mode in all of this. I think I'll stop there, Greg. I realize it's very spotty, but as I say, these are literally just notes that I took during the course of an entire day of extraordinary discussion. If you really want to know what happened, you got to go watch.
Yes, the pile of notes I have, it's going to take me a while just to dig through them all. Really so much was in there, so much between the lines. We touch on the highlights, but you really have to go back and watch the full videos, because every time I looked at some of it again last night, there's nuggets all over the place that I missed even the first time through. It was really an extraordinary day. And we're going to be continuing these chats online on Discord, so that people pick stuff up and put it in Discord. We'll get additional discussion, etc. A couple of notes. First, a quick one. When captioning, we will try to always put the name of the person talking. The caption will try to always put the name of the person talking before they put the captions up. That will help if you can remember to mention the name. If you've been introduced, you don't have to mention your name because somebody just said, here, Vint, so people know it's being passed to Vint. But if you're talking and you haven't been introduced, if you mention your name, that makes it nice on the captioner, which makes it nice for all those of us who have to rely on captioning.
I'm sorry, Greg, it's Vint. I just wanted to interrupt with an observation about mischief. Of course, if you really want to cause trouble, announce yourself as somebody else and then say something outrageous.
Say something really controversial. Oh, turn your camera off and do that. No, for ASL, those of you who are relying on ASL, it is possible to pop the window off so that you can have it floating, and that makes it a lot easier to size it and things like this. But to do so, we have to tag it. So we asked everybody in advance to let us know. If you use ASL, you want to pop that window off, and you forgot to tell us in advance, just send an email to FOI, Future of Interface, FOI@umd.edu, and she'll tag it, and then all of a sudden you get extra privileges. Be careful though, don't turn your camera mic on, because you actually get thrown into a different category, and you can go live if you're not careful. So if you need them, you can do that. And again, anybody wants mischief, we'll catch you. Write this down. Everybody should write down FOI@umd.edu. And anything that you have as a concern or a problem or you spot, you can send an email to that, and the crew will be there to pick up and help you. And Crystal just popped that into the chat, so you'll be able to see that there as well. Okay. So
Greg, it's Vint.
Yes.
I wanted to draw attention to the Q&A, which has already got a couple of comments in it. One of them asked, when will the videos be available from yesterday's session?
Okay, we're going to have the videos. They will all be available, and we'll put this link in the chat as well. They will be available on futureofinternet.org, which is the website that we showed you a bit yesterday. This is a work in progress, but in the auditorium there, you will find all of the videos. They will appear there as soon as we can get them processed. We've got to get captions embedded in them, or available with them, I should say. And we also want to embed the interpreter so that they are available and get them all up. So as soon as we can get that all processed, I would say, by next Monday for sure, you'll have them. I think it just takes a little while. It's a lot of video there, and we've got to also break it up into pieces so that you can actually go to particular items rather than have to watch the whole day through in order to get there. Okay. All right. So very briefly, today the focus is on, yesterday it's like what's coming, and today it's going to be what are we going to do about it. So the day will begin by going through, and we have panels on key topics like DBI and XR/VR. There's one just focused on cognitive language and learning disabilities, because that's an area we just really aren't addressing. We haven't been able to address. It's not that attention hasn't been paid toward. Every time we get any meeting about what needs to be done around accessibility, we focus more on cognitive language and learning than anything else. It's a huge population. It's a diverse population, and we've had really limited tools to deal with it. These new technologies are giving us things that allow us for the first time to be able to think of things like cognitive AT and things like this. I mean, we've had some, but not nearly as effective or as broad reaching as the others. So that's going to be a really interesting panel. All of these are 1 hour long. All of these are not meant to really discuss these in depth, because we just don't have time. We would have to have a day for each one. The key to each one is to figure out, and this is what we want the focus to be, is what are the barriers that we see these new technologies creating? What are the opportunities that we see them creating? And then what do we need to do to address the barriers or capitalize on the opportunities? That's the mantra, those three. What barriers, what opportunities, what do we need to do? We don't need to do it in the meeting, of course. And so that's always hard, because once you start talking about these things with a whole bunch of the really creative people that we have this today, it's going to be very hard to get off of that. At the end of the day, we're going to be gathering all those up. So as we're going on, please write down your notes as to things that you think that either didn't get brought up, issues that should be covered, things that we need to do. Because at the end of the day, we're going to harvest all those, and that's going to be the beginning of the creation of the research agenda, which is the major output or impact of this. We can talk about it all day. Conferences come and go, but the research agenda, listing what we need to do, has got to be key. So before I toss it off, Vint, you had another comment.
Yes, just one more. Yesterday, as I was listening to these various discussions, it occurred to me that over time, what we might want to do is accumulate examples of successful accessible interfaces, along with an explanation about why they worked, and also examples of things that didn't work and don't work and why they don't work. And I think this is a powerful contribution because people learn a lot from why things don't work, maybe more than they do about things that do work. And so having that growing catalog over time would be extremely valuable for a consultation. Second, I think as we go along over the next 10 to 20 years, having open source software available that aids accessibility would also be a very useful kind of practice to engage in as a standard thing that we contribute open source where we can to improve accessibility. And third, everybody remembers what happened when PowerPoint came along. People were enabled to make slides themselves instead of having to turn to specialists. And we could argue that the slides were mediocre or something, but the fact is people were empowered by that. And imagine for just a moment that we might have a PowerPoint for accessibility, in the sense that you have a bunch of tools that are available that have the aggregate capacity to enhance your ability to create accessible applications. So I'm not quite sure what that would look like. You know, it's sort of like the pinball assembly sets where you drag and drop pieces of the pinball machine. The idea that you could have a set of tools that enhance accessibility would be very useful. And then finally, something that you've drawn attention to for quite some time now is the possibility of developing software that has the ability to automatically adapt to user need based on feedback that the users offer. That in itself can be very powerful, because the designer of an interface can't know what everybody needs. The requirements are extremely diverse. But if there's a feedback loop that allows for some kind of adaptation, then people can naturally specialize. And here I urge not to have 7,000 buttons and you know, knobs to twiddle, because people just can't do that. We need a much more natural interface that adapts to your reactions to how well the interface is doing. Okay, that's my you know, just short list of things that I've already concluded we should be thinking about.
Excellent. Thank you very much.